Welcome to Lecture 23, Music, Culture, and the Brain. So we have an interesting question. The question is, how does music affect your brain? Well, there's some really great research about this. And when we look at the music in the brain, watch what happens. And these are some graphic representations. So for instance, when you hear music, you could be in a grocery store, you could be in an elevator, you could be in just a car. But if you're just hearing music, the auditory cortex has this inside-outside, simple to complex activation. And it just automatically registers with the auditory cortex. But then if you imagine music, so sitting where you are right now or watching this, if you just imagine a piece of music, look what happens inside your brain. 3 areas, the auditory cortex and the inferior frontal gyrus. Now, this is part of the brain which retrieves information, and the dorsolateral frontal cortex, the stuff you hold in working memory, all of a sudden gets activated. Well, if you play music, look what happens to the brain. Now, you don't have to be a professional musician to do this. If you play music even for fun, look at the 8 areas of the brain that get activated. The auditory cortex, the visual cortex, if you're reading or imagining a score. The parietal lobe, this is a computation of fingerings or hand coordination. The motor cortex, this coordinates body motion. The sensory cortex, like if you're touching the instrument, just to know that you're touching it or hitting the right keys. The premotor area, this is the sequencing of time in your brain. You're literally creating a sense of time. Your frontal lobe, this plans and organizes the whole activity. And then the cerebellum, which smoothly integrates all these other things. So playing music is, and pretty much listening to it is a whole brain activity. Now, music also causes arousal, just like sex, drugs, rock and roll, and food do. We react emotionally to music, and there are the ventral tegmental area, and it's the same area for sex, food, and drug arousal, and the amygdala, which is part of processing negative emotions, but also can inhibit negative emotions. For music you find pleasant. Stuff you don't like, wow, it innervates that, and you have a negative response to it. But all of this is about memory. Music only happens in memory because once a note is played, it's gone forever. And so it's that sequence of notes that triggers things in our memory. So we have short-term or working memory, as it's sometimes called. And that just kind of, as things are happening, we're starting to really recognize them and use our memories to identify what they are. Then we have long-term memory, which is the storage and retrieval idea of remembering a song we've heard before or an experience. And then we're building new connections in the brain called synapses, especially for hearing a new piece of music. It's recreating other things we already know, but putting it in a different process. And then if you're playing music, it's muscle memory. It's memory without thinking consciously about it. You just automatically move your fingers if you've memorized those patterns. And then we have something called the hippocampus. And when we say that we're really feeding the hippo, we're really saying that we create learning and memory strategies to maximize the short-term to long-term memory. The name hippocampus comes from the horse monster in Greek, the hippo for horse and campos for monster. It's just kind of a seahorse-shaped structure inside the brain, and it's used in sequential and temporal learning, so learning in time or sequences. And the amygdala is an almond-shaped structure inside the brain. That comes from 2 Greek words, almond and eidos, which means like an almond. And it's a critical boost for long-term memory and emotional events. Now, it can really get triggered for negative emotions. If you're under stress, all of a sudden you're learning to survive. It can sometimes be effective for really helping with memory. But also, a training technique we use is called context learning within an emotional context. And that really seems to help memory. In complex vertebrates, which includes us, humans, the amygdala perform primary roles in the formation and storage of memories associated with emotional events, positive or negative. Music can really trigger those things, both positively and negatively. And finally, I mentioned muscle memory, and this is a physiological adaptation. It's how your body adapts to certain things, like brushing your teeth. I would think you probably don't sit there when you're brushing your teeth thinking about brushing your teeth. You might be thinking about the beach, or I got to get up early, or I got to go to work, or whatever activity is going to follow while you're brushing your teeth. But that's just done in absolute muscle memory. And we have a process called habituation, where if you do this enough, then it's stored in the motor cortex, and boom, you can just brush your teeth without thinking about it. Now, if you get an injury, sometimes you have to relearn those muscle memories. And then it's an unconscious process. You're not actually thinking about it while you're doing it, not of the actual motions. You're thinking about something else. So the conclusion is pretty straightforward. The experience of music is a whole brain activity, unless you're just listening, just kind of hearing it. And since we all have virtually similar brains, this seems to be universal. So music can trigger, one, emotions, and we call that arousal, as in dancing or high energy activities like sporting events. The memory of events or ideas, and then finally feelings of religiosity or love or peace. And all of these ideas, music can really have an important part. Now, what's the purpose of knowing that? Well, when we start looking at different cultures, we begin to have another question we want to ask. What commonalities are there with traditional music around the world? So if we all share the same kind of brain, what commonalities do we see with traditional music around the world? And if those commonalities are close enough, does it add more evidence to the notion of, out of Africa, human migration of music along with cultures? And can that explain some of the similarities? So let's look at some of this evidence. There are three common characteristics of folk music, traditional music in all cultures. One, formality. That's how formal the making of music and listening to music is. And what we mean by that is how organized is it in the group? Do we have a lot of people? Do we have just one person? And usually when we're thinking of formality, we're thinking about a lot of people getting together, almost an entire community, making music together. Then arousal simply means how high or low energy is elicited in the music. So, and how it affects the listeners and musicians. So does it cause high arousal and excitement, or does it cause peaceful arousal? So those are things that seem to be common in all cultures. And then religiosity. How much is music associated with the experience of religion and spirituality? So let's look at each three. Formality means usually large audiences and many instruments. And they're often ceremonial events, and frequently they're for adults-only audiences, because it's like a ritual that is described for the adult community. And though informal events that involve many people can be with children or no audience at all. So it might be just a group of children singing together. So formality refers to large groups getting together to sing and make music. And we see that in all cultures. Then arousal, as I mentioned before, and this is the high energy events involving high arousal. That, for example, ceremonial dances, they have a high arousal purpose. So we elicit this stimulus, your brain has some really cool activities in the thalamus and then all those other brain things we mentioned before, and you get two kinds of arousal, either autonomic arousal, that's your just central nervous system doing its thing, or a conscious emotion. It could be fear, it could be joy, it could be many of the emotions that we all experience. So what we look at is the level of arousal in different cultures. Is it high or is it low, depending on the type of song that's sung? And then religiosity. These are ceremonies like in funerals. We find that they're really high in religiosity for obvious reasons. there is this idea of transcending beyond the normal experiences of daily life into another realm. And those without a spiritual context were obviously low in religiosity, like just recreational dancing, for instance. So when we look at the four universal categories of song, we have lullabies, dance songs, love songs, and healing songs. Now the chart on the right of the slide shows you the difference between dance songs in the blue column. It has high formality, high arousal, but low religiosity. Lullabies are low in all three categories. They're very peaceful. They're usually, one person and a baby. And then with love songs, you'll notice that they're low in all three areas. When they're usually sung, the arousal of a lot of excitement and that sort of stuff is usually low, but there's a connection that's usually made with that. It's a different type of arousal, but not what we're usually thinking of high energy. It's still low energy. And then finally, healing songs have high formality, high arousal, and high religiosity in almost all folk cultures around the world. So they usually, believe it or not, it's the whole community that gets together to sing to help heal a person who has a certain malady. The other thing that we look at is the variability in songs. And the way we can see how they're different from each other is their melodic complexity, how the melodies change, and whether the rhythms are complex or not. Most of the research now seems to indicate there's almost no statistical difference between songs and cultures. Is that the melodic complexity and rhythmic complexity are similar enough that they seem to be almost the same around the world, which is really interesting evidence. So your assignment is the usual. Watch all the videos and lecture and take the Google Doc quiz. See you in class. Thank you.